Baku, a breath to spark the human heart. G'day, friends and family, and thank you for joining me on this episode of the Baku podcast. And this episode, I'm calling it The Waters of Your Heart. And that's what we'll be talking about today. It's been a little while since I've shared a Baku podcast with you. Been up to a few other things, but today I'm sitting here and I feel like this one has hit me with a bit of a splash. See, a few weeks ago, I was actually out in the backyard and I was trying to fill the dog's water bowl. An ordinary task, fairly simple task, a task that we should be able to complete with a fair degree of competency. But I had the flu, and in my flu-induced state, things weren't perhaps as easy as they normally are. So as I was holding the hose on the dog's water bowl, I discovered that the water kept bouncing off and covered my legs in water. And I thought, just watching the way the water behaves here, there's a podcast in this. So today we're going to find out if there is. So we'll be talking a little bit about the water cycle. I'll share an ancient proverb with you from the Hebrew Bible. And of course, how can we talk about water without talking about Bruce Lee? So let's get to it. Firstly, I want to share a couple of observations about water in our natural environment. Because you are made up of about 55 to 60% water. And children are actually about 75% water. See, because replenishing the water in our bodies is essential for our survival. So depending on the temperature, we will only survive about 3 days without fresh drinking water. This may vary a little bit. If it's a little bit cooler, we may survive a little longer. Or if it's a little warmer, I believe that survival time can be reduced to even less than a day in extreme circumstances. So water is essential for our survival. It also seems quite scarce. I mean, in Australia we have occasional droughts, and we talk about water saving or water restrictions that are in place to try and preserve our supply of water. But when we zoom out and we take a big picture perspective, we realise that the Earth's surface is covered in 71% water. More than half, nearly 3/4 of the Earth is covered in water. But of that 71% of the Earth's surface, of that total water supply, only about 0.5% is usable fresh water that we can consume. So, to try and put this into perspective on a smaller scale, if we had 100 litres of water, perhaps a spa or something like that sort of size, with about 100 litre capacity, only about half a teaspoon of that water would be safe, fresh drinking water for us to use. So it seems quite scarce. But if we zoom out again and we think about water from a big picture perspective, we have to remind ourselves that it's also a completely renewable resource. See, every drop of water that exists on the planet Earth today has been here since the beginning of time, because we exist in a closed loop system. Imagine the stories that every drop of water could tell us. Imagine the dinner tables that they've been served at, the barreling waves that they've been a part of, perhaps the ships that they've been involved in sinking, the storms that they've been that they've rained down on, the waterfalls, the rivers, the wine, the coffee, the beer, the tea that they've been a part of. See, because every drop of water has been around the cycle more than one time over the course of billions and billions of years. So water has many functions. It supports plant life and animal life. It shapes the landscape as it's part of the erosion process, shaping the cliffs and the rocks. It provides passage for ships, which allows us to float heavy goods between continents. And it provides a recreational environment. I mean, who doesn't love going down to the river or the beach for a swim on a hot summer's day? Or perhaps going for a surf or dropping the kayaking and going for a bit of a fish. People love diving under the water and observing all the fish and coral life down there. And we also use water to clean everything from our cars and dishes to our teeth and to the cells in our body. But if we take a step back from it, all this water as it goes through its journey and its many uses, it gets dirty. It picks up toxic contaminants. It gets a bit too salty to be really useful. It carries bacteria and chemicals that make it unusable, and it's not always ready to drink. But fortunately for us, nature has this process of renewal, and every drop of water can be made good again, clean, renewed, and fresh. I think this was really drilled home to me when I went out to the Barwon Water Treatment Plant here at the end of 13th Beach with a group of kids a few years ago. And the fella who showed us through was extremely knowledgeable about the water cycle and the way that water is made usable and drinkable again. And he pointed out to us that what they do at the water reclamation plant out there is they don't impose anything on the water that comes in there. I mean, they pump sewage into this plant, and then they pump it out as Class C and Class A water for reuse and reconsumption. But what he pointed out was we don't actually do much to the water. We simply provide the right environment for the process to take place. So the stages of the water cycle which they facilitate there, the water comes in through the sewage pipes and it goes through filtration, sedimentation. They have to aerate it, and then, of course, it's redistributed at in various stages of renewal. So all this is about the external observations of water in our environment. And one of the cool things about observing the world around us is that it often has a lot to do with the internal processes that are taking place within us. And this isn't anything new. This is something that the wisdom traditions have utilized for centuries. And today I want to share a little proverb from the Hebrew Bible that talks about this, and specifically about the waters of your heart. But before I do, I should note, whenever we translate or whenever we read any passage from any sort of ancient text, we need to be aware that that text was not written in English. It was being translated many different ways by different people at different points and places in time. And depending on where we're situated, the texts that we have access to play a significant role in shaping our worldview and our attitudes towards ourselves and people around us. So this proverb comes from Proverbs 4, verse 23. And depending on which tradition you grew up in, you may have had a different version of the Bible sitting in the pews. So some people, if you go into a church, let's say we visit 5 churches in our local postcode here in Torquay. We've got a Catholic church, a Uniting church, an Anglican church. There's sort of a Baptist church, a couple of little independent ones floating around the area as well. If we went into those churches, we'd probably find a different version of the Bible sitting in each pew. So, Proverbs 4, verse 23. And the curious thing about the different versions of the Bible, it often becomes a quite contentious point of debate for people about which version is the most accurate theologically or historically, which one has been translated the best. And often these debates take place between people who have no capacity to translate those Bibles from the original language, nor do they have an awareness of the way those translations have been put together from not one but multiple sources of that text in the original language. So let's have a look at a couple of translations of Proverbs 4 verse 23. The NIV Bible gives us this. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. The NRSV gives us this. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. And the King James Version gives us this. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it springs the issues of life. And the Good News Bible, be careful how you think. Your life is shaped by your thoughts. Now, interestingly, each of them, there's a common thread there about guarding, keeping, or being careful. There's a level of vigilance involved in each of those translations, which got me thinking. I wonder what this word guard has been translated from. So I don't speak Hebrew. I'm not very competent in terms of translating it. But fortunately for us nowadays, we have this tool called Google. So we're able to very quickly type in Hebrew word for guard, Proverbs 4:23, translations. And Google very quickly provides us with a list of answers. So as I was doing this, I discovered that guard can also be interpreted as watch, observe, or keep. Observe and guard are two very different dispositions. If we think about guarding something, we might have an image of the armor guard guys who cruise around in those armored vehicles, moving cash from one bank to another with their guns strapped to their belt. And if we're guarding something, we become very suspicious and vigilant of our surroundings. We're looking out for dangers that might try to take what we've got. Or perhaps the other way of guarding something is we think about a prison officer who's guarding prisoners, and their job isn't to prevent people getting in so much as it is to prevent people, the prisoners in this case, from getting out. So if we're guarding our heart, two possibilities are we're stopping it from escaping, or we're stopping others from coming into it. Either way, it's a very closed off disposition. But what if we took the translation option for observe? Now, observing something is quite a different disposition to guarding. When we observe something, we're quite passive. We sit back, we take it in. We might be a little curious. We just watch and we let it be. It's far less active, far less vigilant, far more curious, and just allowing things to be as they are. So observe. And then the second word I wanted to look up, guard being the verb, or observe, to heart being the noun. And heart in the Hebrew translates to heart, or mind, or conscience, or center, or middle. And all of these translations for heart do share something in common in terms of being about somewhere within us that we do some thinking or feeling or a bit of both. We might think about the difference between the heart and the head, as the head being responsible for the intellect, cutting through things with questions and comparisons, and the heart being more of a intuitive feeling sort of space within us. Less voluntary thought, more intuitive, more emotional, more heart-centered. And of course, when the head and the heart are in congruence, things flow quite easily and effortlessly. And when they're in dissonance and tugging at opposite ends of the rope, we find ourselves under tension. So, a translation I'd like to propose for Proverbs 4:23 that I'll work with today is observe your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. Observe your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. If we think about what this could mean, we might turn to perhaps the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who says, watch your thoughts, or observe your thoughts, for they become your words. Watch your words, for they become your actions. Watch your actions, for they become your habits. Watch your habits, for they become your character. And watch your character, for it becomes your destiny. Interestingly, two different places in the world, two very similar ideas about observing our thoughts or observing the thoughts of our heart. Because what we allow and what we see taking place in our hearts does shape what we think, what we do, what we say, what we set ourselves up for in the future. So as we're observing, I want to flick back now to the idea of the water cycle, because the state of our heart, the waters of our heart, just like the water in the waters of the world around us, they go through things. They go through experiences, relationships, stages of growth and development, and they take on stuff. And when that stuff gets too much, those waters get muddied and we lose clarity. And perhaps there's a few things floating around in there that don't need to be there anymore. And we need to observe this taking place and just allow the right environment for the next stage in that renewal process to take place. So, of course, the first stage in the renewal process for water is filtration. Out at Barwon Water, the sewage gets pumped in through big pipes, and the first stage of the process is the water goes into what look like giant front loader washing machines with perforated drums that spin around. And as the water comes in, the water spins out through the little holes, leaving behind all the major contaminants that have been flushed down the toilets or caught down our stormwater drains. So as you look into these big drums, you see wedding rings and toothbrushes and lighters and cash and batteries and all sorts of other stuff that's not supposed to be in the water. One fellow actually showed us a picture of a dead calf that made its way down the sewage pipe and into the water plant. Obviously something that is not good for the water. So as we filter the water of our hearts, we just need to drag a net there across the surface, observing the waters of our heart, and just see what gets caught up there. What doesn't belong? What have we perhaps been holding up or floating around in there that's no longer good for us, good for the people around us, or good for what we're looking to contribute to the world? And we can just skim those things out off the surface. Once those big things have been removed, we move to the second stage of the water renewal process, which is aeration. Once the water moves, it gets sort of poured out from the big drums at Barwon Water there, out into these giant holding tanks that are made of concrete. And they're outside and they look like giant lap pools that are end to end, and there's about 8 of them. And the water's pumped out into these giant pools. As it's pumped out, as it's poured out into those big giant concrete tanks, there's quite a lot of turbulence. And the water's churned up and aerated, and then they add more air to it. Because what's happening is all the little bacteria that's accumulated, all the residue left behind from all the garbage that probably shouldn't really have been in the water in the first place, or perhaps as the water's done its job and cleaned things, it's picked up all these contaminants and it's left behind this bacteria. Little tardigrades and other microbes make their way into the water and they start to eat the contaminants. This is a mysterious and unseen process because we can't see them with the naked eye, only under very powerful microscopes. And these little microbes do their job. They eat the bacteria and then they die and they become sediment. Without the air in the water, without the turbulence, these little creatures don't survive. So that's why stagnant water, if it sits still for too long, can become quite gross. But as the water's churned up, these little microbes might make their way into the water, and they breed, and they eat, and they consume, and then they die. Which leads us to sedimentation. Now, for sedimentation to take place, for all those little tardigrades and things which have done their job and they've cleaned up the water for us on an unseen level, for them to settle to the bottom, the water needs to become quite still. So the aeration in the tanks is turned off. And by aeration, I mean like imagine a backyard spa with the bubbles going on. The air's turned off and the water is allowed to sit still. And as it sits still, all the sediment, all the dead microbes sink to the bottom and they form what looks like a thick sort of humusy mud type material at the bottom of the pool, allowing the fresh water to rise to the top. So we can observe this within the waters of our heart too, because experiences that leave us with elevated levels of perhaps cortisol or adrenaline, when we're under high stress situations for long periods of time, all that stuff gets cloudy and murky in the waters of our heart, and we need to allow enough stillness for that to settle, for that sedimentation process to take place. While we were away last year, we came across a fella who had just left the police force and was allowing himself the time to do just that. Cruising along, finding a few little waves, camping in a very simple setup in a camper van, just to give himself that time for all those chemicals to just make their way out of the system. So there's a stillness as part of the process. And wisdom is knowing when to be still and when to allow that sedimentation to happen. Because on the other side of that, of course, those waters are going to be more clear, more fresh, more ready for what's coming next. But it also means we can't sit still for too long. Because if you've ever left your dog's water outside for too long, you'll notice that things start to grow in it. It becomes stagnant and it's not particularly usable again. But what we have to do is we have to skim that fresh, good water. When it's good enough, we skim it off the top and we pour it into whatever's coming next. And not all water comes off the top equal. Out at Barwon Water, they've got two classes of water that are a byproduct of the process that occurs out there. Majority of the water actually isn't really reused. It's simply pumped back out into the ocean as Class C water. And it's still quite high in nutrients, which are good for plant life and fish life, but not so good that humans would want to consume it yet. They also pump that Class C water out into nearby farms, where it's kind of a double whammy because it waters and fertilizes the crops out there. But again, it's still not really safe for humans to come into contact with. And then there's Class A recycled water, which is so refined because they put it through another set of filters and UV treatment before they pump it out to the purple taps in our yard here in the local estates, where we can use it for gardening, we can use it to flush our toilets, we can use it for cleaning our clothes, but they still don't allow us to drink it. But that Class A recycled water is so refined that it actually tastes like nothing at all. And in places around the world where they do drink Class A water, I'm told that they actually have to add a few things back into it, just so that people have that familiar water-like taste that we're all quite used to. And so why does this matter? Because out of the waters of your heart, if the waters are good, we're going to produce good things. Whereas if they're not so good, there's still a bit of contaminant left, well, whatever we're producing might make ourselves or others around us a little bit unwell. So observation allows us to notice, well, what is the condition of the water? What's it good for at the moment? What are we going to pour it into next, where it's useful and has purpose without causing harm to ourselves or to others? So which relationships? How are we going to choose to pour that water into creative endeavours? Are those ideas good? Are they good for work? or perhaps the process needs a little more time. And the beautiful thing about the water process is it's not linear. It actually jumps back and forth. So we might go through filtration again, or perhaps we need to allow a little more time for sedimentation, or perhaps we just need to mix things up and be a little active and turbulent to allow a few more microbes in to do their thing. So water, when it is good enough and we're choosing to pour it out into something new. I want to turn now to the wisdom of Bruce Lee, because how can we talk about water without talking about Bruce Lee? Because Bruce Lee writes this: empty your mind, be formless, shapeless, like water. When you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. When you put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. And when you put water into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now, water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. So when the waters of your heart are good enough, and the intellect kicks in because we've been observing this process and it says, yes, this is good enough to pour it into the next thing. A couple of questions that you might ask yourself about that next thing. Is it deep enough? Because like the dog bowl, if you put too much energy and too much water under too much pressure into that dog bowl too soon, the dog bowl actually doesn't hold that water and it bounces straight back out. So you might ask yourself, well, it is the next thing, but it's not very deep. Or perhaps I'm coming at it with too much force and I'd be better off to just trickle in a little bit of water first. Because one of the things I used to be fascinated by as a kid when I was washing Dad's car was that if you turned the hose on and you pointed it into the bucket, if you put it on full pressure, all the water would bounce out. But if you just open the tap a little and you let a little bit of water flow in, the bucket could hold the water. And then once there was enough water in the bucket that you could submerge the nozzle of the hose, you could really crank up the pressure and fill the bucket much more quickly without it bouncing out. So perhaps there's some wisdom in that too. Whether you're pouring yourself into a cup, a bottle, or a teapot, how much pressure or how much do you want to open up the tap as you're approaching that new venture, that new relationship, that new business, that new sport? Because of course with things like sports, if we pour ourselves in too hard too early, we run the risk of becoming injured. And then that may be the end of that sport. Same goes for relationships. We pour ourselves in too hard too early, become a little strong, and perhaps that relationship doesn't reach a point of maturity that it could have. And similarly with business or art. Maybe there's some wisdom in just testing the waters a little bit. Just noticing how that vessel holds the waters of our heart as we start to trickle it in. A couple of other ideas about water as you're pouring yourself into new things. And of course, we use these sort of metaphors all the time. Are we just testing the waters? Do we find ourselves under pressure, or are we barely treading water? Are we just floating along? Are we really sinking into it? Are we waiting for something to come out in the wash? Or perhaps we've been a little turbulent and unsettled, and we just need to wait for a little more clarity before we move forward. So whether you're pouring your heart into a relationship, a job, a project, a new training, parenting, learning something new, your marriage or your business, I hope that this metaphor of the water cycle gives you a point of reference as you sit with and observe the waters of your own heart. That was a bit of a blender episode. We just threw a few things in there. I hope it has some value for you. As you go out this week, as we're observing the waters of our hearts, might we be granted patience, gratitude, and inspiration at whatever stage of the renewal process we find those waters in. Thank you so much for joining me on the Baku podcast. And until next time, Baku.